Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be learning about iterating arrays in Java. But first, we need to understand what iteration actually means. To do this, let's just look at an array. So as you can see, I have this array which has 5 elements, each with a certain value. Now, iteration is basically the process of visiting each element of the array and performing some operation on the element. So in this case, I'm visiting the first element and I'm storing that 13 in a variable, or basically in this case just a box, and then I'll visit the next element, the next element, the next element after that, and then finally the last element. So iteration is just this process of visiting each element of the array, usually to perform some operation on that element. Well, your first question might be, what is the difference between accessing a value the normal way and using iteration? The important difference is that iteration is much faster and more efficient. This is because we use loops. We use for loops, while loops, or a different kind of loop known as a for each loop to iterate an array. Now let's just look at an example program to understand how this could be important. So as you can see, I made this array called B which stores 11 values. Now let's say my task is to print these values, and you can see how that could be quite difficult, because I would have to add a println statement for each one of these values, and I need to keep accessing these values. Well, we know how we can access the value. We can just say b at 0 to access the first element, b at 1 to access the second element, and so on. Even for 11 elements, the code is going to be really long. Imagine this was something like 100 elements or 200 elements. It will be very hard to print all of them individually. And this is where we simplify our task using iteration. So now let's actually try to get some intuition on how we can iterate an array using loops. And to do that, let's just look at an example of a simple loop. So as you can see, I made this for loop over here, which is actually really simple. All it's doing is that it's making an iterator called I, which is first set to 0. It's giving me a condition that I should be less than or equals to 24, and then it has an increment operator which just changes I by 1. And after that, we have a println statement that just prints the value of I. Now, the whole point of this loop is that as long as this condition is true, this statement is going to execute. As I increases, eventually the condition is going to become false, and so this statement will not execute. If you look at this loop, it's basically printing values from 0 till 24. If I run this, you'll notice that all values from 0 to 24 are printed by the loop. And this simple idea is what we're going to use to iterate our array as well. So I made this simple model of a loop, and as you can see, it has all the 3 elements of a loop. First, I'm setting my iterator to 0. I'm initializing it to 0. I have my condition that my iterator should always be less than or equal to 4, and I have an update which increments my I value by 1. Now we notice that when our loop starts, our iterator is equal to 0, which is the same as the index number of the first element. So since our condition is true, we're first going to increment the value of I, and I is going to become 1. After I is 1, we notice that our condition is still true. So we're going to increment it again, and I changes to 2. Our condition is still true. 2 is less than or equal to 4. So we'll increment it again to give us 3. 3 is less than or equal to 4. The condition is true. We're going to increment it to 4. Now our condition is actually still true. 4 is equal to 4. So we'll have to increment it just one last time to give us 5. And now that I becomes 5, we notice that our condition is no longer true. 5 is not less than or equal to 4. So our condition becomes false. And since it becomes false, our loop breaks. Now the reason I showed you this simple example is to just show you the correlation between the I values and the index numbers. In all our iterations, I was 0, 1, 2, 3 and 4. Eventually 5, but our loop did break when I became 5. So we're not going to consider that. We notice that all values of I are equal to all the index numbers of my array over here. As you can see, I made this array B which has 5 elements, 13, 45, 22, 8 and 1. And I also made this for loop, and I just need to add the iterator, the condition as well as the update. Now we know that our iterator should start at 0, because my index numbers start counting from 0. So we'll just say int I is equal to 0. Now in this case, my loop should end when I is 4, because 4 is the index number of my last element. So we'll just say I is lesser than equal to 4. Remember, this is the same as what we saw before, and our update will just be I plus plus. We'll increase I by 1 so that I can access every index number. Now we're just going to display the elements of this array. So let me just add a println statement. So after I do this, let's just print I. Now what would happen over here? This will just print values from 0 till 4. If you run this, you can see that it just prints the values starting from 0 to 4. It's just printing the index numbers, but I don't want the index numbers, I want the elements. So let me just make a small change. Let me just change this to b at I. So when I is 0, it's going to print b at 0, which is 30. When I is 1, it's going to print b at 1, which is 45. When I is 4, eventually it's going to print b at 4, which is 1. So let me just run this program, and you notice I get all the elements of my array. I just made a small change in my array. My array originally had 5 elements and added 6 more elements. So now it has 11 elements. If I run this program again, it's going to print the first 5 elements. So it's going to print till 1. So if I run this, I will get the first 5 elements. But you can see that since the length increased, I will have to change the condition. So my last element is the 11th element, and the index number of the 11th element is 11 minus 1, 10. So we'll just change the condition to I is lesser than equal to 10, and when I run this again, you can see that I'll get all the elements. So just by changing this condition, I can change the number of elements I want to print. And something else that we can also change is the iterator. Just by changing where the iterator starts, we can print the values from a certain element. So in this case, maybe I want to print from the third element, 22. I'll just change this condition to start from 2, because the index number of the third element is 2. When I run this, I'll get all the elements starting from 22 till the last element. So something else I can also change is the update. In this case, if I make I plus plus into I plus equals 2, you will notice that it doesn't print every element. It skips an element. So if I start at index number 2, it will print 22. After I plus equals 2, it's going to print 1, and then 44, 88, and then finally 12. So if I run this, you can see that it doesn't print all the elements, just some of them, depending on my update. So just by changing how this loop looks, I can print selected values of my array. Obviously, you can do a lot more using a loop, but we'll look at that later in a later video. Now let's actually try to look at how this is going to look like as a while loop. So remember that a while loop looks nearly the same as a for loop. The only thing that changes is the order in which you have your iterator, condition, and update. So I just commented my for loop over here, and I'll just add my while loop. So the first thing I need to do to make my while loop is I need to create the iterator. So let's just say int I is equal to 0, and the condition needs to be stored in the brackets. So while I is lesser than equals to 10, we're going to perform some action. In this case, the action is the same as before. We're just going to print the values. Finally, we need to update the value. So we'll just say I plus plus. All this is doing is the same thing. It's just printing all the values. When I run this, you'll notice it'll print all the values in my array B. Now we can also initialize the values of an empty array using loops. So I made an array called C, which has a length of 10. This means that it has 10 elements, and since it's an integer array, the default value is 0, so all elements are zeros. To take the inputs for the values, I also created a scanner class object called SA. Now I'll just make a loop the same way we saw before. I made this loop where I initially set I to 0. I have a condition I is less than equal to 9, because 9 is the index of my last element, since the length of my array is 10. And then I have my update as I plus plus, which just increments it by 1. Next, I'm going to ask a user to enter a value. So I have a println statement that's basically asking a user to enter a value. And once the user enters the value, I need to store it in a variable, right? So I'm just going to make a variable temp, and I'm just going to store that value, sa.nextInt. So this will store that value that the user enters, and I'm going to enter this value into my array. So what I'll just do is I'll access the element of the array. So I'll just say c at I will be temp. Now what this is doing is that every iteration I enter a value and that value is entered into the array. So initially when my I is 0, the value that I enter is going to be entered into the first position. In the next iteration I is 1. So the next value that I enter is going to be entered into the next position. Eventually my array is going to be filled with all the values that I enter. This is much easier than writing this statement 10 times or writing it 100 times if my array has a length of 100. This is a lot easier to initialize your array. So let me just run this program. When I run this program, we notice that it keeps asking me to enter a value every iteration. Now it does this until the loop breaks. So let me just enter the values: 22, 13, 14, 66, 77, 99, 100, 101, 120, 132, 145, and we can see that I've entered 10 values. Now my array is filled with all of these 10 values. I just initialized my array in a much easier way, and that's it. That's the basics of iterating arrays in Java using loops. Now there is still a lot more to know because we're going to use these loops to perform some operations and actions on the elements of the array. In the next few videos, we're going to look at some common programs where we're going to find the maximum value of the array, the minimum value of the array, or the sum of the elements using loops. As always, thank you for watching.